Picture this. It is the dead of night, July 21st, on the eve of the Battle of Falkirk, 1298. The most feared monarch in Europe, King Edward Longshanks, is asleep on the cold Scottish ground. Suddenly chaos erupts. His massive warhorse panics in the dark and steps directly onto the sleeping king, violently crushing two of his ribs. You would assume a 60-year-old monarch with shattered bones would call for a physician, halt the march, or at least show a wince of agony. Instead, he climbs back onto that exact same beast at dawn, strapping on 50 pounds of chainmail and steel. The psychological toll is immense. He knows his army is starving, mutinous, and looking for any excuse to desert. Bleeding internally and gasping for breath, Edward hides the agonizing pain behind a mask of sheer, ruthless iron. Military logistics rolls from the 13th century, the kind of boring parchment most people ignore, revealed just how desperate the English supply lines were at that exact moment. He was fighting the collapse of his own army. How does a crippled king leading a starving, riotous mob manage to pull off one of the most devastating tactical masterclasses in medieval history? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The sun finally breaks over the muddy fields of Falkirk. The air is thick with the smell of damp peat, horse sweat and sheer human terror. According to the Chronicle of Walter of Gisborough, Edward's army numbered roughly 15,000 men. Just think about the sheer volume of consumption. We are talking about a moving medieval city requiring tons of grain and thousands of gallons of ale every single day just to function. They have been marching through a scorched wasteland for weeks. William Wallace understood a brutal truth. He refused to give the English a traditional battlefield. He starved them. His men burned the crops, slaughtered the livestock and vanished into the fog. Edward's soldiers are running on empty. The men are angry, exhausted and unpaid. Yet, standing on a slight ridge just ahead of them, the phantom has finally materialised. The Scottish army is waiting. Wallace has stopped running. He chose this specific patch of ground, shielded by a hidden, treacherous marsh, to make his final stand. The trap is perfectly set. Sitting in his saddle, fighting the searing pain in his chest with every breath, Edward stares across the valley. Two radically different philosophies of war are about to smash into each other. Thousands of men standing in that mud have less than 2 hours to live. The slaughter is imminent. Wars are not won by swords. They are won by bread, ale, and silver. You can have the most heavily armoured knights on earth, but if their stomachs are empty, they become a violent, unpredictable mob. By mid-July, the English army was rapidly disintegrating. The grand invasion force was meant to be supplied by sea. A massive fleet carrying tons of grain from Ireland was supposed to shadow the army along the Scottish coast. The wind refused to cooperate. For weeks, foul weather kept the supply ships trapped miles away. On land, the soldiers were starving. William Wallace's scorched earth policy had left nothing but mud and ashes in their path. Then, a single ship finally broke through the storms and docked. It did not bring bread. It brought 200 tons of wine. Imagine 15,000 exhausted, starving men suddenly given access to massive quantities of alcohol. It was a recipe for absolute disaster. The Welsh infantry, already holding deep grudges against their English overlords, got their hands on the wine. They drank heavily. Tensions snapped. A massive riot erupted in the English camp at Linlithgow. Drunk and furious, the Welsh soldiers turned their weapons on the English. Chaos reigned through the night. By morning, 18 English clerics lay dead in the mud. The English heavy cavalry responded by riding down their own infantry, slaughtering 80 Welshmen in cold blood. The army was literally eating itself alive. King Edward Longshanks was informed that his Welsh mercenaries were threatening to mutiny and defect to the Scottish side. Most commanders would panic. Edward simply sneered. According to the chroniclers, his response was chillingly pragmatic. He told his officers to let them go. He said he would catch them later and hang them alongside the Scots. He did not care about the internal slaughter. He only cared about the objective. We have to look at the royal treasury to understand his desperation. Edward was bleeding money. He owed massive debts to the Riccardi bankers of Lucca. Mobilising this army cost thousands of pounds a week. If he ordered a retreat now, he would face financial ruin and total humiliation. The expedition would be a catastrophic failure. He was out of time, out of food, and out of money. He needed a battle. When his scouts finally reported that Wallace was camped just a few miles away at Falkirk, Edward did not hesitate. Despite his broken ribs, despite his mutinous army, he ordered the advance. The collision was no longer just about conquering Scotland. It was a desperate bid to save his own reign from financial and military collapse. Throw away the Hollywood image of screaming warriors charging aimlessly across the heather. William Wallace understood the brutal mathematics of medieval warfare. Sending lightly armed peasants rushing toward heavy cavalry guaranteed total slaughter. He had to completely neutralise the English horses. His solution was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. He arranged his men into the legendary Scottish Schiltron formation. Think of it as a temporary fortress constructed entirely out of human muscle and 12-foot ash poles. Wallace deployed 4 massive, tightly packed circles of infantry across the battlefield. The physical mechanics of this structure were incredibly strict. The front ranks dropped to one knee. They angled their heavy iron-tipped pikes upward, wedging the thick wooden bases deeply into the soft dirt. The soldiers standing directly behind them levelled their own spears over the shoulders of the kneeling men. They created a bristling, multi-layered wall of sharp iron. Wallace reinforced this trap further. He forced his troops to hammer thick wooden stakes into the dirt between the circular formations, tying them together with heavy ropes. He specifically anchored this entire defensive grid right behind a treacherous peat bog, hiding the deep mud from the approaching enemy. Consider the basic biology of a medieval warhorse. These animals weighed well over 1,000 pounds. Knights trained them to trample fleeing targets. Self-preservation always overrides training. A horse will simply refuse to gallop full speed into a solid, jagged wall of stationary spikes. The animal will instinctively brake or swerve away at the last possible second. When the leading horses abruptly swerve, the heavily armoured knights lose their forward momentum. The massive cavalry charge instantly collapses into a chaotic, crowded pile-up of screaming men and panicked beasts. The soldiers holding these Scottish pikes were commoners. They lacked expensive chainmail or polished plate armour. Most wore thick linen tunics or boiled leather jackets. Their survival depended on one terrifying requirement. They needed absolute psychological discipline. Holding a 12-foot wooden pole steady requires immense upper body strength. Doing it while the ground violently shakes beneath the hooves of 3,000 galloping warhorses requires nerves of absolute steel. Every man standing in that mud knew the grim reality. If a single soldier gave in to fear, dropped his weapon, and turned to run, a gap would open in the wall. A single gap meant the English knights would immediately pour inside the vulnerable centre of the circle. Total massacre would follow in seconds. They had to stand completely still, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the deafening thunder of the English charge, waiting for the brutal impact. Edward did not rely solely on heavy cavalry to win his wars. He brought something far cheaper and vastly more terrifying. Look at the thousands of men standing behind the mounted knights. These are not English noblemen. Most are not even English. They are Welsh conscripts. There is a dark, bitter irony here. Edward Longshanks had brutally conquered Wales just a few years prior. He built massive stone rings of castles to crush their independence. Now he was dragging thousands of those exact same subjugated men north to crush the Scots. Why fight for the king who ruined your homeland? Poverty and survival dictated their loyalty. The royal treasury paid a standard archer a miserable 2p a day. Even more telling, Edward actively emptied his own prisons. He offered official royal pardons to murderers, thieves, and poachers. He handed deadly weapons right back to hardened criminals, operating on the simple condition that they pointed those weapons at William Wallace. The tool in their hands was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. Carved from a single piece of yew wood, The longbow stood roughly 6 feet tall. Pulling the hemp string back to the ear required staggering physical strength. Modern historians and archers estimate the draw weight hovered between 120 to 150 pounds. You cannot simply pick up a longbow and shoot it. It requires agonizing, repetitive practice starting from early childhood. The sheer physical stress of pulling that string thousands of times literally deformed their bodies. Archaeologists examining the skeletons of medieval archers consistently find permanently twisted spines and massively overgrown shoulder bones. The weapon reshaped their anatomy. They were living, breathing siege engines. Archery was traditionally viewed by the nobility as a minor nuisance on the battlefield, useful mostly for light skirmishes before the real men clashed with swords. Edward was about to completely shatter that illusion. He intended to use disciplined Welsh longbow tactics to systematically dismantle the enemy. Instead of firing a few scattered arrows and retreating, these men were trained to unleash a continuous localized hailstorm of steel. A skilled archer could loose up to 10 aimed arrows a minute. Multiply that by a few thousand men. The math is horrifying. Tens of thousands of projectiles could fall on a single target area in under 60 seconds. Each heavy wooden shaft was tipped with a forged iron bodkin point. These arrowheads were not flat or broad. They were shaped like thick steel needles, specifically designed by blacksmiths to violently punch through the links of iron chainmail. They stood shivering in the muddy fields of Falkirk, pulling arrows from linen bags, waiting for the king's command. The English vanguard did not wait for Edward's command. Commanded by the Earls of Norfolk and Hereford, the heavy cavalry spurred their massive warhorses forward. Glory and ransom money completely blinded their tactical judgment. They wanted to crush the peasant army before the king even arrived on the field. Thousands of hooves slammed into the Scottish earth. The thundering noise echoed across the valley. Then the front ranks hit the moss. William Wallace had chosen his ground with lethal precision. The seemingly solid field right in front of the Scottish centre was actually a deep waterlogged peat bog. Heavily armoured warhorses plunged chest-deep into the suffocating mud. Panicked beasts thrashed violently, snapping their own legs in the thick sludge. Knights wearing heavy iron chainmail were thrown from their saddles. Dragged down by the sheer weight of their own armour, many suffocated face down in the swamp before ever seeing an enemy soldier. The charge instantly lost all momentum. The English commanders violently yanked their reins, forcing the surviving cavalry to split into 2 separate wings. They had to swing far to the left and right to completely bypass the deadly bog. This accidental manoeuvre pushed the heavy cavalry directly into the flanks of the Scottish army. The collision finally happened. It was an absolute massacre, but an entirely unexpected one. The Scottish Schiltrons held their ground. The massive wall of iron-tipped pikes easily absorbed the shock. Horses crashed into the wooden shafts and were violently skewered. Desperate knights slashed wildly with their broadswords, completely unable to reach the men holding the 12-foot poles. The traditional hierarchy of warfare was failing right in front of Edward's eyes. The invincible mounted knight was useless against a disciplined wall of commoners. However, Wallace made a critical error in his deployment. He had positioned his own small contingent of archers from the Ettrick Forest in the open spaces between the circular Schiltrons. They lacked the defensive spikes. The frustrated English cavalry, unable to break the spearmen, vented their fury on these unprotected men. The Scottish bowmen were completely overrun and slaughtered in minutes. The giant wooden hedgehogs survived the initial shock, standing defiant among mountains of dead English horses. The battlefield geometry had just drastically shifted. The age-old debate of heavy cavalry versus longbow dominance was about to be settled in the most brutal way possible. Edward finally arrived on the ridge, assessing the bloody stalemate. He realised the cavalry charge had failed. It was time to change the rules of the game. The English heavy cavalry pulled back to regroup. The battlefield fell into a tense, chaotic lull. Wallace desperately needed a counterattack to break the English momentum and relieve the pressure on his infantry. He looked toward the rear of his formation, waiting for his own cavalry to charge. They never did. Scotland had brought roughly 500 light horsemen to the field. These men were the aristocratic elite, led by powerful, wealthy nobles like the Commons. They sat on their horses watching the English knights effortlessly slaughter the unprotected Ettrick archers. Then, without swinging a single sword or launching a single spear, the Scottish nobility turned their horses around. They rode away. They completely abandoned the battlefield. Traditional history books love to paint this as an act of pure, cowardly treason. Popular legend insists the jealous nobles deliberately betrayed their commander. Wallace was a mere knight, a lower-class upstart daring to give orders to ancient wealthy bloodlines. There is undeniable truth to this bitter class divide. The lords absolutely despise taking orders from a commoner. We must also look at the brutal tactical reality. 500 lightly armoured horses facing 3,000 heavy English war horses is not a battle. It is a mass suicide. The nobles ran the brutal mathematics in their heads. The English had survived the mud. The Scottish archers were dead. If the nobles charged, their aristocratic bloodlines and expensive armour would be wiped out in 5 minutes. By riding away, they preserved the only mobile strike force Scotland had left. The seeds of the devastating William Wallace defeat were planted right here in this cold, calculated decision. It was a ruthless aristocratic choice. The nobles saved themselves, effectively signing thousands of death warrants for the commoners they left behind in the mud. Imagine standing in that tightly packed circle of spears. You just watched your own lords abandon you. The psychological shock is devastating. The very men who demand your taxes and your absolute loyalty have left you to be butchered. The infantry in the Schiltrons was now completely isolated. Their archers were bleeding out in the grass. Their cavalry was gone. They were locked inside their own defensive circles. They could not march forward without breaking the wall of spears. They could not retreat without being run down by English horses. They were entirely paralysed. Edward Longshanks watched the Scottish cavalry disappear over the hills. A grim smile surely crossed his face. The trap was now fully closed. The king raised his hand, signalling his infantry to move forward. Edward Longshanks completely halted his exhausted cavalry. He ordered his mounted knights to pull back and hold their positions. The brute force approach had failed. It was time to deploy a far more clinical method of killing. He signalled his infantry forward. Thousands of Welsh archers and Irish slingers marched into the bloody mud between the dead horses. They took their positions just out of reach of the Scottish spears. Medieval warfare tactics were about to undergo a terrifying evolution right on this field. The entire concept of honourable, hand-to-hand combat was discarded. Edward was replacing it with industrial-scale slaughter. The Scottish soldiers realised their fatal predicament immediately. The Schiltron was an absolute marvel of defensive engineering against a cavalry charge. Its strength relied entirely on supreme density. Men had to stand shoulder to shoulder, wedged together so tightly that a horse could not push through. That exact density just became a death sentence. The giant wooden hedgehogs were completely immobile. The men could not disperse or run without breaking the wall of spears. They were effectively a series of giant, tightly packed bullseyes stranded in the middle of a valley. The English commanders yelled the order. Thousands of hemp bowstrings were drawn back simultaneously. The collective groaning of yew wood echoing across the field must have been deeply unnerving. Then came the release. A localised storm of forged steel erupted into the sky. We are looking at sheer, horrifying physics. An arrow fired from a 150-pound longbow does not float. It arcs high into the air and accelerates violently on the way down, achieving terrifying kinetic energy. The heavy iron bodkin points descended at terminal velocity. They were specifically designed to punch a hole cleanly through forged iron rings. Most of the Scottish infantry were wearing simple linen or leather. The impact was devastating. You must understand the psychological torture of this exact moment. A Scottish spearman holding a 12-foot pike requires both hands. He cannot hold a shield over his head. He cannot dive to the ground. He cannot step backward. He just has to stand there looking up. He watches a black cloud of steel needles blotting out the sun, completely aware that he is about to be violently pierced. Arrows shattered collarbones, tore through unprotected faces, and literally pinned men's feet to the dirt. Slingers hurled smooth river stones with enough velocity to instantly crack skulls. There was no pause. A trained Welsh archer could fire every 6 seconds. Wave after wave of steel rained down on the paralysed Scottish circles. The air was filled with a constant deafening hiss of flying arrows, followed immediately by the sickening thud of iron hitting human flesh. The outer rings of the Schiltrons began to disintegrate. The outer rings of the Scottish infantry began to drop. A devastating chain reaction immediately followed. The structural integrity of a Schiltron requires living bodies pulling their weight. Dead men cannot hold 12-foot pikes. As the front ranks collapsed with arrows in their chests, the men standing behind them were forced to step forward. They literally had to climb over the bleeding, twitching bodies of their neighbours. They desperately tried to keep the iron wall intact. The muddy ground was now completely slick with blood and internal organs. Soldiers slipped and fell beneath the boots of their own comrades. The giant wooden hedgehogs were cannibalizing themselves just to stay upright. The sheer volume of incoming steel was mathematically overwhelming. Human endurance has an absolute limit. Slowly, inevitably, the formations began to unravel. Heavy ash pikes dropped to the dirt. The dense, unbroken wall of spikes became ragged and uneven. Massive fatal gaps tore open in the circles. English arrows were now easily hitting the unprotected men trapped right in the very centre of the formations. Absolute panic finally broke their iron discipline. King Edward watched the Scottish lines violently waver from his ridge. The moment of maximum vulnerability had arrived. He raised his hand and ordered the Welsh archers to cease firing. The lethal hail of steel abruptly stopped. A terrifying, brief silence hung over the muddy valley. Then came the blast of the English war horns. The heavy cavalry was unleashed for the second time. The knights spurred their rested war horses forward, completely bypassing the deadly peat bog this time. They aimed their lances directly at the bleeding gaps in the broken Schiltrons. The Scottish spearmen were utterly exhausted, heavily wounded and drowning in terror. The cavalry charge hit them like a steel avalanche. Knights rode straight into the exposed circles. They hacked downward with heavy broadswords, maces and battle axes. The defensive trap had completely transformed into a tightly packed slaughterhouse. Men finally dropped their useless pikes and desperately tried to run toward the nearby Torwood forest. English horses easily ran them down in the open fields, cutting them to pieces from behind. This was not just a lost battle. It was the darkest, most traumatic hour of the First War of Scottish independence. A staggering portion of the Scottish working class was simply erased from existence in less than an hour. Thousands of carpenters, farmers and blacksmiths lay dead in the mud, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. William Wallace managed to escape the carnage and vanish into the dense woods. He survived, but he left behind the shattered corpse of his entire rebellion. The invincible aura of his peasant army was permanently destroyed. The slaughter finally stopped. English knights cheered from their blood-soaked saddles, celebrating a legendary triumph. They had completely wiped out the Scottish rebellion. But look closely at the aftermath. Look at the mud. The English soldiers immediately began stripping the dead. They found nothing of value. There were no chests of gold, no fine velvet, no rich aristocratic hostages to ransom back to their families. They were looting the broken bodies of desperately poor farmers. They found cheap leather, wooden beads, and maybe a few copper coins. Edward Longshanks stood victorious over a mountain of corpses. Yet, his strategic reality was actively collapsing around him. William Wallace had just suffered a catastrophic tactical defeat. The irony is that his overarching strategic plan, the brutal scorched earth policy, was actually working flawlessly. The English army had marched directly into a deliberate man-made wasteland. Thousands of men and horses survived the battle, which meant they all still needed to eat that very night. There was absolutely nothing left to consume. The Scottish fields were burned black. The livestock was gone. Edward's naval supply ships were still heavily delayed by erratic weather. The royal treasury was completely empty. He could not magically summon bread from the mud. The Welsh archers who had just won him the battle were still cold, starving, and violently unpaid. The threat of a massive internal mutiny flared up almost immediately. The internal slaughter that started at Linlithgow threatened to resume. Hunger was quietly accomplishing what the Scottish spears could not. Within a matter of weeks, the mighty English war machine began to implode from the inside out. Edward Longshanks was forced to make a deeply humiliating decision. He had just annihilated the enemy. He controlled the battlefield. The path to the north was wide open. He could not take it. He had to order a massive, agonizing retreat back toward the English border. If he stayed in Scotland, his army would simply starve to death or tear itself apart. The grand conquest of the north was violently suspended by sheer financial ruin and logistical failure. The Battle of Falkirk was a tactical masterpiece for the English. It was also a strategically hollow victory. Edward proved he could butcher the Scottish working class in an open field. He completely failed to prove he could occupy their country. William Wallace lost his army, his reputation, and eventually his life. But he fundamentally proved that the English Empire, for all its heavy armour and royal wealth, could not conquer a starving, burning land. The war was far from over. The slaughter in the mud of Falkirk changed the world. It permanently rewrote the rules of human conflict. Before this morning, the heavily armoured knight was the undisputed master of the battlefield. Wealth strictly dictated military supremacy. If you had the money to buy chainmail and breed massive warhorses, you controlled the power. King Edward violently shattered that ancient hierarchy. He proved that a starving peasant holding a cheap piece of carved yew wood could effortlessly kill a wealthy lord encased in steel. He took archery from a minor skirmishing nuisance and forged it into an industrial weapon of mass destruction. This exact tactical blueprint laid the gruesome groundwork for history's most famous battles. The devastating rain of arrows that destroyed the French nobility at Crécy and Agincourt over a century later was born right here. Edward perfected the killing formula over the bodies of the Scottish working class. William Wallace did not live to see a free Scotland. His betrayal and subsequent brutal execution in London is a grim story for another day. Yet, his defiance established a terrifying precedent. He proved that a nation's spirit could survive the total destruction of its physical army. The English won the field at Falkirk. The Scots ultimately won the brutal war of endurance. Think about the sheer human cost of that stubborn endurance. Thousands of nameless carpenters, farmers and blacksmiths traded their lives just to bleed a royal empire dry. Their bones are still buried somewhere under the modern streets and parking lots of Falkirk. What would you have done in their place? Would you have held your ground in that tightly packed circle of spears, watching the sky turn black with arrows, fully knowing your own lords had abandoned you? Let me know your honest thoughts down in the comments. If you found this dive into the gritty, unromanticized reality of medieval warfare fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I have plenty more forgotten battles and untold historical truths coming up. Click the video on your screen right now to explore another dark corner of our past. I will see you there.